Hi, this is Nick with 10 Bell Pod, and here's 10 accusations against the fabulous Moolah. So the word of the day is allegedly. These claims against Moolah range from your run-of-the-mill scummy wrestling promoter to being a full-blown criminal and monster. If you want my bias, I believe the victims, and I think it's absolutely pathetic that WWE continues to honor her in the Hall of Fame. There is a reason her supporters and defenders are a tiny minority that couldn't even get a small petition off the ground when WWE canceled her battle royal. Also, why would there be some internet-wide conspiracy against some shitty wrestler from 40 years ago? No one is launching a full-scale attack against George Goulas or whoever. That said, whether all of these are true, some of these are true, or none of these are true, women's wrestling objectively suffered and regressed as an art form under Moolah's thumb. Moolah had no real talent, she had no personality, and she was never a draw like her predecessors Mildred Burke or Ethel Johnson, who were headlining and drawing thousands in the 50s and 60s. There isn't a person in the last 75 years that would say Fabulous Moolah is their favorite wrestler. Yet she somehow managed to be on top of women's wrestling for half a century. She wasn't a 0.1% as skilled as people like Sherry, Luna, Velvet McIntyre, or really anyone in Japan. Either way, I think there's a reason women's wrestling has thrived since her death. That said, let's get into these allegations, and fair warning, they get increasingly dark. If you're not familiar with the name Wendy Richter, trust me, you would have been. Wendy led the way for women's wrestling during the rock and wrestling era, and it's pretty agreed upon that she was as big as Hulk Hogan at the time. She was who Cyndi Lauper worked with and was co-main event of MTV's Brawl for It All and WrestleMania 1, which always seems to be glossed over when it comes to WrestleMania 1 and Cyndi's time with WWF. Then, Wendy made the tragic mistake of knowing her worth. She saw the difference in what the men were being paid and asked for a raise. Not even equal pay, just a raise. So Vince sprang into action with Moolah. November 25th, 85, Wendy faced the masked Spider Lady, who was obviously Moolah, putting up her women's title. Long story short, Moolah got Wendy in a pin, and Wendy clearly kicked out at 1, but the fix was in, the ref tapped the mat 2 more times, and Moolah was awarded the belt. Wendy, the announcers, and the crowd were stunned into silence, and that would be Wendy's last ever match in WWF. Moolah monopolized women's wrestling. Before Moolah's reign of terror, there was Billy Wolf, who Moolah started her career with. He more or less owned women's wrestling from training to shows to booking them around the country. Billy was also an unhinged abuser and trash human, but under him, at least the actual wrestling was on par, if not arguably better, than most of the men in the 50s and 60s. It was definitely more fast-paced and action-packed. Moolah would slowly chip away at Billy's empire, and soon, just like Wolf before her, Moolah controlled the lives of any woman interested in succeeding at a high level in the industry. She was connected to every major promotion, so if you wanted to make any kind of living, it was through her. Moolah had several ways to ensure women had no hope in the business outside of her. Let's start with her training style. Moolah ushered in a subpar hair-pulling, slap-fighting style because she was more concerned with pumping out warm bodies to skim booking fees from than producing actual good wrestling. This further pushed women's wrestling down in the eyes of fans and promoters. As far as training goes, Moolah literally trained her women to work the wrong side of the body. This ensured that only her women could wrestle her women, which meant more bookings from her camp and more money for Moolah. While this may not sound like a big deal, if you work with your hands or you're an athlete, you know it is. After hundreds or thousands of reps, it's difficult to just do it differently one night. Go bat with your opposite hand, go swing a hammer upside down. It's doable, but it ain't good. Moolah took anywhere from 25% to 50% of her girls' pay. Booking fees in the entertainment industry isn't anything new or different. However, Moolah would often not even tell the girls she was doing this, and she definitely wouldn't tell them how much she took. Instead of a set figure like say 10%, she took as much as she wanted. She'd take the wrestler's pay directly from the promoters, skim it, and then tell the women that was their total pay from the show. If you had a problem with it, she'd stop booking you and your career was over because there was nowhere else to go. Moolah forced her trainees to live on her compound, so they not only had to pay her for training, they were forced to pay her rent. Between skimming money off their pay and adding fees like rent, food, utilities, she kept a lot of these women in debt. There are accounts of women wrestlers working for 2 years without seeing an actual profit. If you had a problem with it, she'd stop booking you and your career was over because there was nowhere else to go. If a female wrestler ended up being a little too good, or she got a little too over, or was any kind of threat to Moolah's position at the top, Moolah would just stop booking her. And thus, your career was over because there was nowhere else to go. Like a deranged cult leader, Moolah controlled every aspect of her trainees' lives. She told them how to dress, how to wear their hair, who they could be friends with, and even controlled their sex life. And with that, here's where things started getting really bad. Moolah allegedly had sex with a lot of her trainees. Now, sex of any kind between two consenting adults is no one's business. There are a lot of whispers that Moolah and Mae Young wrapped up their lives together as a couple, and yay, good for them. But then you add things like how morally wrong it is to use your power dynamic to sleep with someone, especially in a workplace. But even if that's 100% untrue, Moolah was publicly an unapologetic homophobe, which is enough for me to write her off. Moolah was allegedly a sex trafficker. Penny Banner said that Moolah would send her half-trained, underage wrestlers to photo shoots that by today's standards would be considered pedophilia and pornography. This was backed up by Luna Vachon on a shoot interview when she was sent to a doctor in Arizona at just 16 years old. Moolah would also send girls out in bulk to territories with the understanding that they were going to sleep with the promoters and male wrestlers. These women were often not told about this arrangement ahead of time, they found out when they got there, and those who refused were often sexually assaulted. Then we get to possibly the most harrowing tale of Moolah's era, Sweet Georgia Brown. Allegedly, Moolah and her husband Buddy Lee tried to hook her on drugs so that they could control her. Georgia Brown was beaten, and Georgia confided in her daughter that she was often sexually assaulted. It is believed that Moolah's husband Buddy Lee is the father of at least one of Georgia's kids through these assaults. She'd also be forced to sleep with promoters and would often come back from wrestling tours pregnant. After working with Moolah, Georgia spent the rest of her life broken mentally, fearful of men and white people, and just trying to piece her life back together, while Moolah continued being booked for the WWE. Also, did I mention Moolah's still in the WWE Hall of Fame?